on a Saturday night, 2024 in March, I think either 22nd, 23rd, my dad died. I was out walking with my friend at around 10:30 p.m., clearing my head because I just seen him in hospital. And when I was in hospital a hour or two earlier, he couldn't speak. He was basically asleep or just out of it from all the morphine. And the nurses kept trying to wake him up because we were there to say hello, etc. But they couldn't really get him awake. So we basically told the nurses that, like, it's okay, don't worry about it, let him rest. We'll come back tomorrow or the day after to say hi. The only real, like, gesturing or interaction that he gave was that he was signaling, like, with his hand for the nurses to adjust the, I guess, like, connection to the oxygen to his nose around his ear because it was irritating his ear and he had like a rash from it, and he was like gesturing for them to move it. That was like the only interaction that he had that night. And so I was there with my mum for maybe 45 minutes or so. Then we decided that it was a good idea that I would go home to sleep. My mum would stay the night at hospital, and I'd come back the next morning to see if he got any better. And at this time, I had seen him, I think he'd been in hospital for maybe a week or two before, and he was talking. He seemed relatively okay. Like the night before I got into hospital, we had a conversation about F1. But this Saturday, it was like pretty obvious that he was getting a lot worse, and the nurses or doctors had no idea why that was. He was like really frail, his skin was pale, non-responsive, and had lost a lot of weight. So I think it was pretty clear to me that things were not going in the right direction. So I decided to leave, went home, and called my friend around 10:30 p.m. I said, hey, let's go for a drive somewhere, go for a walk at the beach tonight, just to sort of relax my brain for a bit. And I think we were walking for an hour and a half or so, up and down the pier on the beach. Then I got a phone call, I think at around 11:30 or so, from my mum, and she was panicking. She was sobbing. So I picked up the phone. She was sobbing, clearly panicking. I asked like what was wrong, and she said that my dad was no longer, his heart wasn't beating. The medical team was rushing to the room. They were asking her, do they want him to be resuscitated? She said, obviously yes. And then she hung up the phone when I told her I'll get there right away. So hung up the phone, basically sprinted from the pier, took my shoes off because I wasn't running shoes, sprinted from the pier to the car, and we drove basically half an hour to the hospital as fast as we could without obviously getting into an accident. And then about 15 minutes into the drive, my mum calls again, and she says that he's gone. At that time, I did not know what to feel, which I think is pretty understandable. You just sort of like, it's pretty hard to process in the moment. I had no idea like what I was supposed to be thinking or feeling, and so I sort of just like blanked out and didn't really react at all. And I just responded, "We'll get there in 15 minutes or so, and just deal with it." So we got there. The priest was there, mum was there, nurse was there, and there was his body on the hospital bed in the gown, just sitting there, lifeless, not breathing at all, which was a very, I think, strange sight to see because I've never seen like a dead person before up close, or at least in recent memory. At this point, I wasn't crying, wasn't angry, wasn't sad. I was just sort of just, okay, this is the new reality now. We're going to deal with it. So we were in the hospital for maybe like 1 hour or so afterwards, getting all his belongings, his jewelry, etc., signing some papers, and then we left at like 1 a.m. or so to get the car. And my friend who drove me, he was still in the car park. His parents also drove to the hospital and were like asleep in their car waiting for us. They came out, hugged us, etc., which was quite nice. And then we just drove home and went to bed. So I think as a 20-year-old, this is a pretty interesting experience to go through. It wasn't exactly a sudden thing that happened. Like, he had been battling with cancer since when I was in year 7 or so. Like, he was told in year 7 that he had like an 18-month life expectancy. Chemo, all the treatments, lots of surgeries, and like a few years later, it seemed like it was getting better. Went into remission, and then the cancer came back. Same story, and then he'd been battling for like the last few years before then. Seemed okay, and then sort of everything just fell apart in the month or two before he went to hospital that last time. So I think yeah, I had no idea what I was supposed to be feeling. Like, it was pretty interesting. I think this taught me a few life lessons, which from what happened 18 months ago. The first of which being that no one will really save you besides yourself. So I think, like, for the most part, we definitely had very supportive friends and family who were helping with all the like funeral arrangements, the lawyers, accountants, logistics of stuff in between houses, etc. My friend and his family who were there in the hospital that night. And obviously at the funeral, like, this, I don't know, like 100 people at the funeral, all his friends, family, work colleagues, they're there to, I guess, celebrate his life, have the service, go to the wake, like eat some food, laugh a bit, drink some alcohol, and then they go back home to their kids and families and sort of wake up the next day and not really think about it again. So I think we definitely had people who were supportive, but in reality, people living their own lives, and the only person that will really get you out of the situation is yourself. I think that was the first thing I learned. So I think for the next 2 or 3 months, I didn't really do anything. And then I sort of made a conscious choice at that 2/3 month mark that I had to take ownership of the situation. So I dropped out of uni despite like being really high grades in high school and university. Looked for the sort of dream job that I wanted, got it, and since then we've sort of been back on the up, resolving everything that happened nearly 15 months ago. I think I equally could have literally done nothing and be a victim of my circumstance, say life is unfair, what can I do about it? But that obviously isn't very productive. I think the second thing I learned was not to try to avoid labeling or saying how like the thoughts and the feelings you have are good or bad. I think for a long time afterwards I had felt very guilty and a bad person for not crying at the funeral. I haven't cried since, related to his death, for being basically like shutting down and not having many emotions for a certain period of time. And I thought I was a bad person for that. But I think the key learning there was that everyone has their own way of dealing with grief. Some people are like really emotional, sobbing, crying. Some people are the exact opposite, which is me, which is basically detaching and basically being distant and not showing any emotions. And yeah, I think since then I really tried to avoid that sort of labeling, because like it's not good or bad, it just sort of is the way it is, and you can consciously make an effort to fix it if you want to, which I've been trying to since. The third thing is like the pretty cliche things that people say, like you're always ungrateful when you have certain things, and when they're gone, then you realize just how much you value them. I think for like since year 7 or so, when you've got his first diagnosis, I was more or less, I basically had detached since then, and just tried to do whatever I can to avoid thinking about it. So studying as much as I could, doing as much sport as I could, music at school, social life, just basically trying to block it out, which I had done probably since year 7 until last year. So because I detached from it like since year 7, and then while I was getting like his treatment, since then I hadn't really, I think, taken the time to really spend a lot of time with him, despite how hard he tried, because I was just so, I just shut it out basically. That was my logical engineering brain thinking solution. So I think if I could change things, I would probably try and do the opposite, and really try and maximize the time that was left, which I couldn't do because I just basically ignored there was even a thing that was happening. So I think on that point, as well as knowing your natural inclinations or natural behaviors or reactions to certain situations, mine is always to avoid problem, distance yourself from problem, block out emotions, and just make yourself as busy as possible to just forget about it. And so since then, I've basically been trying to, I have to self-correct and just try and do the opposite of that intentionally, because I know that when I'm faced with some sort of outcome, some sort of context, my inclination would be to act in that way. So I have to intentionally self-correct and do the opposite, which I think applies to basically everything. So knowing your natural inclinations for things and making a conscious effort to not do that, because it is the path of least resistance, and how you've been trained to do so since you've been alive. Another thing would be recognizing the value of actually good friends. I think just naturally being an introvert, I don't have like that many friends I consider close friends who I spend like a lot of time with. But going through the situation really showed who were the actual friends versus less so friends. When you go through stuff like that, like who was supportive, who was people who were checking in on me, basically like every day for a few weeks after it happened, taking me out to go for a walk, go to the beach, take me for lunch or dinner. Some days I went to the gym 3 different times in one day with different people just to have company basically. So I think as well, the next thing would be just trying to be really conscious of who like your real friends are, and these sort of tough times will show you like who those people are. I think as well the next thing would be trying to be conscious of who you are seeking validation from, or whose opinions you let dictate your actions. So for example, when my dad was around, he would have never let me drop out of university and do the things I'm doing now. Even when I had a gap year, he was pretty fuming about it. And so I think since then, obviously like him not being around helps, but I try and do the best I can now and realize I'll be very conscious of like which who's and like what opinions I actually value and care about, and basically trying to block out everything else and doing what I think is right for me. Because in reality, like very few people have the full context of who you are, what you want to do, the dreams you have, etc. And they will always speak upon you based on their own experience or their own perception of you, which can often be a mismatch between them, like what they perceive you to be versus what you actually want. So I'm not saying to just ignore what your parents are saying, a parent is telling you to do, but just try to make a conscious effort and recognize whose opinions you are actually letting dictate your life choices. And once you recognize them, make the choice of should that be the case or not, and how can you act in spite of it. I think the next thing is just I think it's also pretty cliche, but I'm now very, very conscious of death and think about it quite a lot, which I think these sorts of like near death or seeing other people go through death or near death experiences make you think about it as like if you were to die suddenly, or say in like 1 or 2 years time, like when you die, like would you be content with what you had done before then? And if that is not the case, then I suggest trying to make that the case. So my frame is whenever I do things, I only do the things I want to do with who I want to do them with, and what would make me be content. So I think now I've tried to engineer my life such that like if I were to get in some freak car accident tomorrow, I would be pretty content with what I've done so far. And I think that's a pretty freeing feeling to have. And gives you a lot of clarity on what you're actually doing with your life at the moment. So yeah, I think to summarize those initial thoughts, if you or know someone who is going through the experience of someone close dying, my suggestions would be don't judge your reaction or actions based on that. Don't think there is a right or wrong way to grieve. Try and find ways to make you a better person in the end, and make you like rethink your life choices. Rethink your life choices after then. And make sure you keep your friends pretty close, because they're the ones who will be able to help you when that happens. So yeah, there are some thoughts from a now 21-year-old with basically no life experience, but I think those are just some things I've learned and tried to now apply since then. And now I can say, like, for myself, despite it being a terrible experience to go through, I think it's definitely made me a much better person as a result. And I will never forget my dad, like what he taught me before he died. And I think this will make me a better person and actually make me far more likely to achieve the goals I want in the end. So yeah, I hope that was somewhat useful.